This is Terms of Reference podcast number 151.
There just aren't many generalists around. That's the problem. I don't think there are when you talk about people, and I definitely don't think there are when you talk about organization.
This is Terms of Reference. I'm your host, Stephen Laddick. One of my favorite things about data analysis is when trends emerge unexpectedly. So often, when sifting through data, we find exactly what we're looking for. But it's these moments when we're presented with something unusual that are the real special event. This holds for why I love the monitoring and evaluation process in the social sector. So often I start an assignment with a client with a view about what will result from the research, only to find that after weeks, or more often months really, of living with the data, conversations, and documentation, I see alternative views clearly displayed. The trend I'm pleased has revealed itself to spark this editorial is disruption of the social sector. Somehow, the universe conspired to allow me to have our past two guests on the show, which are Paula Kravitz and Chris Blattman, both of whom have specific views on how we can evolve the sector overall. Today's guest is, happily, another voice whose decades of experience have led to our conversation about yet another aspect of our work that is overdue for a rethink: the ever-present silos we find every day in our work. Silos are everywhere, within organizations, across humanitarian responses, within countries accepting development assistance, and even with our own minds about how our worldview and approaches to work. This isn't a new problem, and one I can personally attest is alive and well, so much so that the term multi-sector initiative is something donors are interested in hearing, and a topic that was a key focus for a recent guest here on Terms of Reference, which is Patrick Fine, the CEO of FHI 360, as he talked about integrated development. My guest for the 151st episode of the Terms of Reference podcast is Tim France, who's the managing director of Enish Communication. Tim came to his passion for communication through the health sector, in which he holds a PhD. As you've come to expect from this show, Tim is nothing short of a true expert, having worked for the World Health Organization's Global Program on AIDS, UNAIDS, the Rollback Malaria Partnership, and the founding of Health and Development Networks, among many, many others. I'm excited to bring you this conversation about a new tool developed by Enish called Sdg Insights, and how that becomes a platform for Tim and I to talk about the need for disrupting the social sector to break down our silos, and why this has never been more important. I spoke with Tim in Chiang Mai. But before we get started, a brief word from our sponsor.
The Terms of Reference podcast is sponsored by International Solutions Group, helping to improve the social impact of governments, UN agencies, NGOs, and companies for more than 10 years. Visit ISG online at www.theisg.com.
Hello, Tim. Thank you so much for being on the Terms of Reference podcast today.
Thanks very much for the invitation. It's a pleasure.
Tim, you are the lucky first guest that I've had on the show to be in the same country as I am, since our move to Bangkok, as many of our listeners know, happened about 5 months ago. So I'm pretty psyched to actually be in the same time zone as somebody. That's a help. You're up in cool Chiang Mai, right?
That's right, up near the mountains in the north of the country, so an hour's flight away from Bangkok.
So nice. We met recently at a USAID event, and I thought that you presented a compelling product called Sdg Insights that I want to talk about, but I also want to get some background about your organization called Enish Communication. But before we do that, so many of the listeners to the podcast are interested in, how do you create a career, and how do you build stability or build success in the aid and development business? You're a PhD. You actually started in the molecular biology world, working in a lab, and you stumbled into communications. Can you give us the 2 or 3 minutes on that, how that happened?
Sure. Well, with a caveat that if anybody wants any advice about careers, I'm the worst person to ask. But you're right. I did start out in a lab doing research on what controls breast and prostate cancer. And this was in the UK, and it was in the time of the Thatcher government. And at the time, they were just really killing the research budgets and the university budgets. And I got involved in a campaign called Save British Science, which was really kind of an advocacy and publicity campaign. And just got further and further into it, and went back and studied journalism for a year or two. And then one day was really lucky enough to be invited to Geneva by David Heyman at the World Health Organization to work on an annual report, just a research chapter of an annual report for the Global Program on AIDS. And I was supposed to be there 2 weeks, and I ended up staying, I think, 3 years, resigning from my job and ended up staying there. And it's that seems like a long time ago now, and I've been through a number of working with non-profit organizations, starting my own non-profit, and then in the end decided that a communications company was the best way to go.
And just so we have some background, tell us about what is Inish? What do you, as a communication company, you've definitely targeted and have focused yourself on how do you communicate doing the good work that you do? I assume that's purposeful, given your background. But it's also, why don't you tell us about it? I won't put words in your mouth.
Yeah, essentially we're a kind of a one-stop shop in a way for international organizations and non-profit agencies. So we work with groups, all kinds of groups, from UN agencies to big NGOs, big international NGOs. And what we're at, the kind of underlying idea behind the company is really that people can communicate their impact more than they do at the moment, that people are sitting on nuggets of information and knowledge that aren't really shared that effectively, and that's a really important thing to help happen. So we're a for-profit, we don't hide that, and we provide services to a number of different organizations.
The reason I was especially interested to have you on the show is because of Sdg Insights. A good chunk of our guests talk about the SDGs. That's the focus of their work. There's importance around that because it's essentially the new agenda. And you've created a product that breaks the mold a little bit. It provides information to people in a unique way. Why don't you first tell us about what it is and what it does? But then I'm really interested in the background to it, the story behind it, about why it's important.
Yeah, well, maybe just kind of back up a bit. You start talking about the SDGs, and I should mention that Sdg Insights is not really something. It's not something that any of our clients have asked us to do. This was just something that over the past 10 years of working with many different organizations in different sectors, it really appeared to us as a kind of a need, as a quite clear need when we kind of stood back and looked at the big picture. But let's just go back to the SDGs a bit, because I don't think it's us that have broken the mold. I think the development model mold has been broken by the SDGs. I think that we mustn't just slip into thinking about the SDGs as, and not just yet another way of doing things or an extension of the Millennium Development Goals. I think fundamentally the Sustainable Development Goals change everything about the way we do development, humanitarian, and environmental work.
So take me there, because I'm the newbie on the street. I'm somebody who's listening to you right now, and why does the S replace the M and they're not the same thing? Why are they so fundamentally different?
Well, I think you do have to go back a little bit in time. If you look back to the kind of 80s and 90s, there was unbelievably, now when we look back, incredibly, there was these two main kind of threads of development thinking that were happening at the time. One that came out of this process called the Brundtland Commission, and the Rio Earth Summit, which was this whole thread focusing on development and protection of the human environment, natural resources, environmentalism, really. And the second thread, which was kind of characterized by all of these international summits and conferences in the 90s, was the kind of focused on social development and equity discourses, so about all the things that were affecting people. So in effect, we weren't really talking about the people and the planet together. And then there was even a third thread, which was the kind of what do we do about emergencies and crises and the whole humanitarian response to things that happen where we need to respond immediately, that kind of relief operation. So I think up until the SDGs, we really thought about these things quite separately. And the Millennium Development Goals were really in the middle one that I just described, the social development and equity discourses. And it wasn't until we came after the idea of sustainable development, this new concept, really came out of a meeting that happened in 2012, which was the 20-year follow-up to this Rio summit that happened in 1992, which really said, look, folks, isn't it time we brought all these things together and addressed them in a more integrated way and a less siloed approach to development? And so you could really say that the idea behind the SDGs has been brewing and predated the Millennium Development Goals in many ways. So it's nothing like a follow-up to the MDGs. It's just it's an idea whose time has finally come after about 20, 25 years of talking.
Did it take 20 years for the mental model to be created? Or here's really what the question I want to ask. So often the good idea that you have, as aidpreneurs, entrepreneurs out there, it comes to you in a flash. You build the prototype for it in a weekend, and then, you spend the next 4 years of your life building it, refining it, and selling it, right?
Yeah.
Do you think that it was already there and people are like, we got to figure out how to do this, and it just took 20 years to kind of get the machinery in place?
I actually think it happened more like that flash of lightning than we realize, because the ideas were there, and these ideas have been there a long time, as I say, for 20, 25 years. But what really needed to change was the circumstances in the world. So, and the time had to be right for this to happen. And I think that's what happened. So, for example, we're in the middle of the Millennium Development Goal period, and that's one thing I didn't say about the Millennium Development Goals was essentially that was a donor agenda. I mean, in the late 90s, when we finally got to the point where we were over the Cold War and all these other problems were over, some people kind of call that the golden era, at least in global health. And we were able to do whatever we wanted, and that meant that donors were able to do whatever they wanted. So in many ways, the MDGs were what the rich countries of the world wanted the poor countries to focus on as priorities. And then in the middle of that, so the Millennium Development Goals ran from 2000 to 2015. In the middle of that, 2008, we get a global financial crisis. And this idea that rich countries were going to perpetually fund, aid and development kind of came to almost the train almost came off the rails, I think, at that point. And so what changed really was the environment in which these kind of development and aid, and in particular aid effectiveness and what value for money meant, the environment in which they were taking place completely changed. And what that did was, I think even right up until, we were in kind of probably 2012, 2013, and it was like it was just a time was right for a few countries, really. I mean, Colombia, a number of other notable kind of countries came forward and said, hey, we have to redesign what happens post-2015. Why don't we just try to be much more ambitious? And they pushed it through. They actually got it through. I couldn't believe it. I think there was a lot of objection. It wasn't coming from many of the big countries. It ended up being an agenda that was really driven by the smaller countries, the poorer countries of the world. And I think they got it right. Now, they would say that was the hard work, but I think now is when the hard work begins, that we actually say, okay, we've got this integrated agenda where we've put all of these threads of development and environmentalism together. Now, how do we do it? And everyone's like rabbits in the headlights, like, oh, wow, well, yeah, we actually have the agenda now. So I think it actually happened just in a relatively short period of time. I think it was from probably middle of 2013 to summer of 2015 when the Open Working Group report, which ultimately fed into what the Sustainable Development Goals became. When that was all created, it was done quite organically. We had millions of people contributing to the World We Want survey, and it was a very open, inclusive process. And once it started, it was just unstoppable. There was no way that small number of donors in the OECD countries could say, wait a minute, stop. But what we don't have in place is the financing. Every other framework before has come with some kind of a deal between rich and poor countries, but here we don't have the rich countries saying, okay, if we do this, we'll pay this much. And it's really, the responsibility has shifted to individual countries. So I'm not saying it's all rosy in the garden. We don't know how this is going to be paid for. And there's no one's got a checkbook at the moment, given the current financial situation in the world and geopolitics. No one's about to write a check to pay for it. So we have to find the money too.
And as we know, the money is often a deal breaker, right? I mean, it's a classic problem for, in the nonprofit and humanitarian aid development world. And there's always great ideas, but going and finding the cash for it is increasingly difficult. So you've given us this run up to the SDGs and how they hold such potential. Now take us to Sdg Insights. This is one contribution that Inish is making. Tell us about what it is. What does it do? What insights does it offer? Why is it important?
Right. Well, where that whole kind of discussion about the SDGs takes us up to is kind of, well, where are we? They've all kind of created an environment in which we now have to make things happen. And kind of as we worked with various organizations over the past, particularly the past 4 or 5 years, we started to identify really common barriers, and many of them are communication barriers, that was really kind of getting in the way of these integrated approaches. So, and we really set out to develop a tool to overcome those barriers. So let me just briefly explain what those barriers are, if that's okay. I mean, first of all, what's happened with the whole kind of history of development, but also kind of, science and technology as well, is one of the major problems we face today is fragmentation among specialists. And this whole, we talk about siloed approaches and everybody recognizes it. Nobody really knows what to do about it.
Is this the every problem is a nail, if you're a hammer kind of fragmentation
Well,
issue?
yeah, we used this great photo. Somebody took apart an old Volkswagen Golf, and they took apart every single piece of it and just spread it out in this lovely white studio and photographed it. And this is the way I see the development sector is, that the handbrake doesn't know what the gear changer does, or if you're a wheel, you don't know what the suspension does, even though you have to work really closely together to make the car run. And it's just kind of a complete lack of awareness of what one another do. And even though we're dependent on one another, so it's kind of, the left hand really not knowing what the right hand is doing. And that leads to the second barrier in many ways, which is a kind of a failure for us to really kind of to think together. That sounds cynical, but when you think about it, we're really good at kind of debating and trying to set up a kind of a discourse where we say, okay, there's this side and that side, someone's got to win. Or you've probably been to, like me, many development meetings where everyone gets around the table and we're good at the second D, which is discussion. And everybody puts their issue on the table, obviously not forgetting their own priority because they want to make sure that's in the agenda as well. But what we're very bad at is the third D, which is dialogue, which is kind of actively listening and kind of saying, well, what can we create together that isn't new? Not just how can I get my work supported? And this might sound like a very specific way of looking at what happens in development, but we fundamentally believe this is a really important barrier. That in itself drives a third one, which is that people is kind of there's this very low level of intersectoral literacy. So let's say, for example, you want to develop a new approach which combines the climate or meteorology and global health. That requires those two sectors to understand a little bit about one another's world sufficiently that they can actually enter into that dialogue. But our literacy and our understanding of one another's areas is very low because we've become so specialized, so kind of ring-fenced, so siloed. And then the fourth barrier is really about it's supposed to be a part of the solution rather than the problem, which is the nature of the internet and the way it's being used. It's supposed to be a solution, right? We're supposed to get information from the internet. But the way that many of the big information platforms are being built and developed, they create bubbles or filters which select out and filter information for us according to what these systems and algorithms think we need to know. So, we've all heard this about Facebook and things like this, but it operates on a much larger level with platforms like Google. So, we're not getting raw results when we trying to find and search information from the internet. So they're four main barriers. One of the opportunities that we've also identified is that when you kind of join together some of these disparate points that seem to be unrelated, that's when you get the most amazing aha moments. And I'll go into some more details about that. But this is essentially what we tried to, about 4 years ago, we said, is it still possible to build an information system that deliberately introduces you to new ideas, that pushes us towards new areas of thinking?
So I've got to
and that was
ask,
what we tried to decide. Yeah,
I've got to ask because the fourth piece that you brought up there, the echo chamber of the interweb, right? This is what people are, it's all over the world now about Brexit and about the election in the United States. That right. people are in their silos. So if you were looking at this 4 or 5 years ago, and I don't mean to put you on the spot here, but was this something that you saw coming? Was this something that you were kind of raising your hand and saying, "Oh my gosh, look, this is totally possible"?
we didn't see it as having that kind of level of impact, to be honest. I mean, we didn't really think that it would affect elections, but we definitely thought that it was affecting the way we did development. We weren't thinking about politics. We weren't. We were thinking, how can we get people to work together more effectively? So we were, in a sense, we were asking the opposite question of not what problems will be generated or what are the consequences if this is allowed to just run amok. But we were thinking it from the other way around, which is how can we design something that doesn't work like this so we can counteract these problems? So we were actually looking at it from the opposite side.
Two other things I'd like to lay over your 4 points that I've talked about on the podcast quite a bit and in other forums and whatnot is that, one, I've characterized in the development and aid world, it's filled with really, really smart people. Right? Mm-hmm. Lots of PhDs, lots and lots of master's degrees. And, we tend to be, we're a sector filled with experts. And I wonder how much that contributes to the fragmentation and the inability to have literacy about others, right? So I guess the second piece there is we've found, at least in the consulting world, the people that are easiest to work with are generalists. Right? Mm-hmm. The generalists are the people who are able to connect those dots, who are able to, work between topics and work between situations and kind of be fluid rather than sort of having, hey, here's my hammer, where's the nails at? Have you found those pieces as well, or does that resonate with you?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. There just aren't many generalists around. That's the problem. And I think you
really think so? There's not that many journalists around?
Well, I think.
That's a startling point to me. I honestly, that would surprise me.
I don't think there are, and I don't think there are when you talk about people, and I definitely don't think there are when you talk about organizations. And most people working in development, they kind of, they take this they have to take the line of their organization quite often. And so I've seen many great specialists who, are brilliant people, go into large organizations and bureaucracies, and it absolutely kills them if they stay there too long. Because they're not allowed to think outside of their own silo. They're forced to think in line with their own organization's priorities and objectives, and sometimes survival, I have to say. I think there's a dimension to this that is related to that kind of the history of development as well, because if you look back, we've been through various periods where and I think our understanding of the development needs and also the way that development responses are designed is all about how big is the world, right? So it doesn't have a long history, development and humanitarian work, really, after the Second World War for most organizations. So up until about the 90s, development was all really about understanding, about mapping, about standard setting, and just trying to help organizations to deliver. And many of the big organizations we're talking about in those circumstances were intermediaries for other people. They told us what the priorities were. But as the world got smaller, and for example, TV and ultimately the internet became more widespread, we could see. So it's no coincidence that we could see for ourselves. So it's no coincidence that in the kind of the mid-80s, we could see the famine in Ethiopia and people saying, wait a minute, this isn't enough. We need something different here. So it was kind of, created a new period because the world was getting smaller. And that kind of golden age, really, where there was money and resources and awareness of what needed to be done, it kind of created the need for advocacy, right? So it was like, let's promote our issue. Let's make sure that, and personally I saw this with development issues like HIV, where advocacy wasn't about how can we integrate HIV into other problems that are happening in the world. It was like, how do we get money for HIV? And it was done very successfully. So the individuals and the organizations, and all of these organizations have one specialization in their name, basically, or in their mandate, if it's not in their name. They're a child organization, or they're an HIV organization, or they're a water or an agriculture organization. They're all differentiated. And that period kind of forced people into this kind of competition, if you like, of saying, well, our issue is the most important one. And so they were deliberately siloed. That was what was required in order to do well. But now we're entering a period now where the world is even smaller and the demands are even greater, right? So we've got unprecedented levels of humanitarian need in the world, with 1 billion people on the move, 6 million refugees. I mean, the number of crises and conflicts and things, it's just completely out of control. In the history of development, we're now seeing bigger demand than anything. So and also we've got the internet and information overload that everyone is experiencing. So now we're entering an area where we really need those generalists, and not just the generalists, but what we really need is kind of objective, unbiased thought leadership. That's the critical missing ingredient. Now, it's not just generalists. It's almost like going back to the first days of the printing press and saying, who's going to read all these books for us and tell us what to think? We need thought leadership. And there was a time when these organizations, if you had a big enough logo, you were the thought leader. But it's changed now. It's different now. And it's kind of,
anybody who's got an internet connection can call themselves a thought leader now.
Well, they can call themselves a thought leader. Most people don't. The first rule of thought leadership is not to mention it, of course. What you require in order to be a thought leader is the ability to connect apparently unrelated ideas. That's what thought leaders do, right? Thought leaders tell us things which are new and unique. They give us new perspectives and ideas, and they typically venture away from the norm. That's the exact opposite of what some of these big development organizations typically do. So we need generalists, but they're only now beginning to kind of I think it's a generational thing. I think that digital natives can do this and digital nomads can't. So people who are, I'm not sure how old you are, Stephen, but people who are my age or above.
I was just going to say, you got to define what a native and a nomad is.
Well, it's kind of, people who've grown up with the internet and people who haven't.
Okay.
So
just for the record, I'm 41. Yeah. There you go.
Yeah. Oh, okay. I'm a little bit older than you. I'm 55. But, for me, just speaking personally, for me, I'm still at that kind of awestruck stage where I'm like, you mean I can look anything up in the world? Wow. I can just sit here with my laptop right now and look up anything. But for another generation of people, they're not even aware of that. They're not even thinking about that. And younger people, I think, are much better. So you can be a specialist and you can be a thought leader because of the techniques you've learned, not because you're a generalist. You just think in different ways, and you are used to juxtaposing information from all these different sources. And I think that's the skill we need. So I think generalist has been reinvented as we enter into this kind of era of thought leadership. And what's really interesting is, well, what comes next for organizations if they can't be that thought leader? And think about an organization like the World Health Organization, right? It's very difficult for them to be at that cutting edge of new and unique perspectives and ideas, venturing away from the norm. That's almost impossible for a big organization. So what's their role going to be going forward? Is it to facilitate this process? They've got, I don't know how many thousands of global health organizations that are doing this, that are slightly more nimble or more inclined in this direction. But I think that resonates with me, that what we need is generalists. But we need generalists who are equipped with these kind of, it's almost like Renaissance people. Again, we need a breed of Renaissance people who can connect meteorology and climate change and changes with our oceans and where we get our food. And there aren't many people who are that generalists, who have that kind of literacy, who can join dots in informed ways. I'm telling you this as if this was why we invented this tool called Sdg Insights.
I was just going to say, please take me back to the tool and tell me that this is you guys are in this room with these, this whiteboard and these lines drawn across the room, like some sort of insane people saying, "Look, it all works, it all makes sense." But I'm assuming that's not true.
Well, I'd love to be able to tell you that was the truth, but actually no. I mean, we kind of came at this from a very practical point of view. We were, as a communication company, we were quite often asked, and still are sometimes, we don't do it so much now, but we're asked to manage and develop communication strategies for some of these organizations. And what we saw, this was a few years ago now, maybe 5 years ago, we saw all of these organizations doing exactly the same thing, particularly when it came to social media and so on. They're all looking for the same kind of fantastic nugget of information which would make them look insightful, that would make them look really clever. They make this connection before anybody else, and this has helped them, for example, with their social media presence. And, if you think about it, everyone's trying to get these connections first. There's a kind of a race because, this is currency now. This is legitimacy. Mm-hmm. So we developed this tool in-house which makes these lateral connections. It's actually the first, as far as we know, it's the first lateral search engine that's designed specifically to do this, and it's been designed.
Okay, so go back to the layman for a second.
Right.
Juxtapose lateral search engine as opposed to Google. What's specific about that? What does that mean?
Yeah, well, let's work through an example and the differences. So let's say I'm interested in malaria, for example. If I go to Google, and I'm probably going to do this while we're actually talking. So if I go to Google and I type in malaria, I'm going to get all kinds of things that come up to the top of that search, which are based on things like, the Wikipedia of malaria definition, news from CNN and all the kind of the big ones, because Google gives us things which are ranked according to their popularity. But it's basically taking me further and further and further down the malaria rabbit hole, right? It's getting me further and further and down everything because it finds the word malaria in the title or in the first 100 words and things like that. Whereas with our platform, what we deliberately said was, let's go the other way. So if I type in malaria into Sdg Insights, it will show me things like, it will take me to things that are about water and sanitation, or about other vector-borne diseases, or about the climate that affects vector distribution, like mosquitoes and things like that. So it deliberately kind of works in the opposite direction, horizontally, and that's what I mean by lateral search. Because if I want that kind of literal rabbit hole approach, I'll go to Google. We're not trying to put Google out of business, although I wouldn't mind.
Sure, that'd be awesome.
We're not trying to outcompete Google. I mean, for God's sake, Google is a verb now, right? So we're never going to shift people's minds away from thinking that's what search is. So what we're trying to do is offer an alternative. So at those moments, people might be writing a proposal. They might be saying, well, why is this result important? What's the impact of our work? They might be just writing something around their subject. It might be the introduction to a proposal or something. When at those moments when you need to think laterally, when you're looking for new ideas, that's when you should turn to a different kind of unfiltered approach to just identifying those dots so you can then join them. Because otherwise, the problem is most of us are so kind of locked in our silos that we don't know what are the dots that we should join. I'll give you a really concrete example. I just read something this weekend. A team that were working on vaccinations in cattle in Kenya had a very successful program. They said, this is having this impact on the diseases among cattle. I can't remember the name of the cattle disease, but and one day they said to themselves, I wonder if this is what kind of impact this is having on the communities. And what they did, they kind of went out in concentric circles, and it turns out that the villages or the samples where the cattle were successfully vaccinated, there was a kind of a noticeable, measurable increase in the number of girls going to school. Wow. Who would ever have made that connection?
So if you vaccinate a cow, girls get educated.
Right, because there's a knock-on effect with the wealth of the families. And the boys, the money that's available for education is already being spent on the boys. So it's the marginal increase in the wealth of those families that then allows girls to even consider going to school. And it's just because it has a general effect on the well-being of the families that then it has a kind of indirect effect on girls going to school and school attendance among young girls. I mean,
so did this insight come to you through somebody using Sdg Insights, or was this a completely independent? This is just an example of how lateral.
This is just an example, but it was somebody who, as a result of this conversation about lateral connections, they kind of got in touch over the weekend and said, wow, you've got to look at this example. It's amazing. I really believe that we can kind of increase the likelihood, because at the moment we just rely on serendipity for these things to be connected, or some brilliant. I don't know what led. I'm going to get in touch with those researchers in Kenya and find out why did they even think that? Why did they even ask that question? Yeah, but we rely too much on serendipity.
We rely on serendipity. But then I'm thinking to myself, because I don't want to toot myself and toot my own horn, but this is something where I feel like I do it naturally, right? Where you try to draw from lots of different experiences. You try to draw from hey, I've worked in Ethiopia, but I've also worked in Thailand, but I've also worked in Nicaragua. Mm-hmm. And, what did I see in those three places were the similarities and where the stark differences. And those, the differences are where you really kind of have to concentrate, or maybe you're looking for the similarities. Mm-hmm. But maybe then it's really the cross-disciplinary piece, right? And that's the frustration I usually have where, as you've put literacy about other topics, that was your third piece, where someone who's looking at health has a hard time thinking about technology, has a hard time thinking about poverty reduction, or maybe not a hard time thinking about it. It doesn't come across their desk.
Well, and I think there are all kinds of reasons why those barriers are sustained. It's also about cultural differences. I recently had an opportunity to work with a project that was cutting across, you can probably guess, but across meteorology, right, and weather prediction and malaria. And it's just amazing how the cultural differences between those two, the organizations that work in those two silos are not just working on different things, they're completely different organizations because they've come from completely different backgrounds, right? So the health organization is nearly all MDs. So they're all into diagnosis and, the whole medicalized approach to everything in the world. Well, the World Meteorological Organization, they're kind of a network of national meteorological societies. They were really based on the shipping industry, right? We wanted to know what the weather was going to do because we had to move stuff around the world. So they've kind of been associated much more with the private sector, much more pragmatic service delivery kind of thing. So they've got completely different frameworks and ways of thinking. Now, both organizations are reinventing themselves for the 21st century, but from completely different places. So it's even difficult for those people to talk to one another because they have a different language. No, I don't mean kind of ordinary language, but they use different terms. They have a different vocabulary. They've got just different ways of thinking. That's where the literacy barriers often come from. And I think that's where the dialogue barriers come from too. It's not just enough that one person's got varied experience, and geography isn't everything. It's like, how many people have actually worked as, an anthropologist and an agriculture extension worker and as a doctor. And, I think it's really important to have those kind of cross-disciplinary experiences as well, because that's what I mean. I don't think there are many generalists. I just don't think there are. I mean, there are lots of people who don't know much about anything, but there aren't many people who know a fair bit about a lot of things. They're just not. That's different. I see lots of people who are generalists because that's all they can be. They never made it to be a specialist. Sorry, that sounds very cynical. But
before you and I, put our foot in our mouths. So you built this tool. What happens next? Are you out there actively promoting it? Do you see an evolution to it? Do you see this is where it fits in? This is a service that you kind of put in play for an aid agency, development agency. Do you have an API to it that people can link to? I mean, what happens next?
Well, we're not actually sure. So to be totally honest, I mean, one thing that we've got to a point now where we said, okay, well, this actually, because we built it for ourselves, and ourselves is just the 15 people in our company. A number of other partners who work really closely with us. So at one point, a couple of years ago, we said, wait a minute, this is actually of much greater value than this. So we started to kind of scale this up to make and perfect it so it could be made public. We launched it on the day that the SDGs were launched in September 2015. So we've now got about 500 users or something, which has been a really great test bed. But now, the advice we get is that we're probably wrong with the way that it's designed, that actually when people really get hold of this in numbers, they're going to use it in a way that we haven't predicted. So we're really trying to find out now, rather than focus on improving the tool, we're focusing on trying to understand as best we can what are the pains and gains that this can actually serve to either address or create. And so we're going back to our users and back to a much larger group of people and saying, are we right? Are these barriers real? Because we could make the tool 10 times more efficient or better at what it does now, but unless we're right about these barriers, and we're right about the opportunity of joining dots and the potential of joining dots that people are not aware of yet, unless we're right about those fundamental barriers, the tool's never going to be used. So we have to go back and validate our thinking and build an evidence base that these barriers really are a handicap for people and ask them if they experience them.
What's your time frame for making that happen? I mean, I guess, should people pause when they think about coming over to using SDG Insights, or are you still looking to grow that user base, and every voice is, it's important to continue to get those new voices in there?
Yeah, absolutely. We're trying to do, I wouldn't want to discourage anybody. Get over there and do it. I'll give you the URL in a minute, but we really do want to expand the user base. But from a kind of anyone who invents something, when you invent it and you launch it, your priority is to get people using it. And that was what we'd spent the last year doing, was really kind of trying to explain this and perfect the story that we wanted to tell around it. And we relatively recently realized that there was actually this whole other set of evidence that we need to compile. So we're doing both at the same time. So what we're doing now is we're kind of rolling out, we're planning a series of webinars where we talk to people not about the solution, but about these barriers and about the opportunity and kind of generating that serendipity. Like, let's increase the probability a bit. And then asking people if they recognize this, and that if these barriers resonate with them, it's something they've experienced, then come and help us develop this and improve it, and tell us how they would like it to work if it currently doesn't work the way they would like it to. What would be the most useful? So we're kind of looking, we imagine that that's going to be probably the next year or two while this is evolving. Meanwhile, SDGI deliberately avoided the kind of technical description, but it's already compiled close to 3 million articles about the SDGs over the last 12 months. And so we're not worried that we're wasting our time. That is all, evolving and building into a really useful corpus of knowledge, which is going to be available for current and future users of SDG Insights, however long we take to get there. So, the urgency is really coming from the issues. We want this to be useful for helping people to work in integrated ways across the SDGs as quickly as possible.
Does this become a model for how Enish approaches clients? Is this something that you put on your business card and you say, hey, look, this is our approach to your problem? Or is this a completely separate business line? It's
completely separate, and I'm really lucky that the people downstairs in their office allow me to do this, because it in some ways it kind of it's drawing resources away from our business. This at the moment isn't a business line. This is just a way of thinking, and an experiment that's already been lasting it's already lasted 3 or 4 years. So I feel really lucky to have this kind of environment where I can do this.
But you just are Google. You're sitting in the Enish exam, equivalent of Google X, right?
Well, I'd like to think we have a little bit more scruples. But, for example, we really do, we have some principles that we would stick by, and making this available free, with no kind of filtering and, I don't know how, I have no idea how this is ever going to be turned into a business model. But I know that was the way Google were at the beginning as well. But that's not our goal. That really isn't our goal. I think that one way that this might influence the credibility of our business is that this is actually going to help us and others to understand this thought leadership process a bit more. Now, whether that would win us more customers for our other work, maybe. But it doesn't mean that we have to monetize what we're doing with SDG Insights. We're hoping that there will be a kind of some kind of a halo effect, and that we're going to learn more about what people are trying to do, so that we can then provide other kinds of services that might help them to do that. In a way, we're trying to understand our client base more.
I'm just wondering if this may be a naive question, but with a tool like this, sometimes what you find is that a guide is needed, and so I'm just wondering, hey, rather than putting it out there and saying, this is something that you can use, Mr. or Miss development professional or aid worker or organization, but it's always a person, right, who's going to be using it. I wonder if you flip it on its head and you ask the question, and you say, hey, organization, what question do you think you're answering, or what question are you working to solve? And there's a consulting layer in there where you basically bring that generalist mindset, that process, because I feel like there's a process you're describing in there that can be codified, that can be realized as a tool in that way.
Maybe, but I think that from our experience so far, most of the organizations we work with, they're just not at that place yet. I started the description of how we came about this idea because we were managing the communications platforms and strategies of organizations. And I mentioned that we don't really do that anymore. And there's a reason for that. And that's because these kind of things have to be done from inside the organizations. That it's very difficult to say, this can be done by an outsider. So there is a possible kind of catalytic effect that you could have within organizations and say, hey, you could actually think differently. You could deliberately, integrate this kind of thinking, this way of thinking. And have you thought about how to integrate thought leadership into the development of your staff, for example? And most organizations are not even at that point yet. Never mind how do they then go on to facilitate or leverage the thought leadership of others. But there's a possibility there. But we're a relatively small team, and we're hoping that we can actually have more of an effect by saying, hey, here's a tool that's available that might help you do this yourself inside. There's only so many consultant hours in a week, right?
Yeah, that's true. We've had a fascinating conversation. Unfortunately, we're going to have to bring it to close. But there's two questions I always ask everyone in this series on innovation and sort of the changing world of aid and development. And the first one is who do you pay attention to? Are there Twitter feeds that you pay attention to, blogs, podcasts, specific sources of information that you think it's important for others to know about, other than obviously SDG Insights?
It's hard to say. We recently wrote a kind of a review of what we thought were the 8 best podcasts, and I don't know if you saw it, but actually we were included in that. So we
clearly I need to get on that list.
Well, you are. I think you have to be voracious, is what the point I'm making. You have to. I can't say there are specific places I look, but you just have to be reading. And I think that's partly where having an academic background personally really helps me, because you don't think about it, you just kind of read. And I think that you have to consume from all kinds of quarters these days. So those kind of, giving recommendations about where to look is a bit hard, but I think just get hold of people and not so much influencers. Most of the social media guides say that you should nurture relationships with influencers. I like to think the opposite way. It's like, and not think about how many followers somebody has, but, everyone has opinions now. And just take the time there is no shortcut. You have to read a lot, and you have to read long articles, short articles. You can't just get ideas from 140 characters. So I always surprise myself the amount of grazing that I do in terms of information. I think that's really important.
The last question I have is, you're lucky enough to have been around this sector for a very long time. You run a communications company in this sector, and you've developed your own products. Outside your purview of being a health expert and being a communications expert, is there a particular process or technology or shiny object out there that you just think is just super cool? Maybe, some group is developing it and you think, it's up and coming, that you'd love to give a shout out to?
Mm-hmm. One that I came across recently, which I was like, wow, I didn't know about that. But it's not unrelated to our product, but it's a completely different dimension to it, is the whole way that computers are being used to generate texts from data. Natural language generation.
So it'd be basically like writing a novel or writing a story based.
Yeah, well, essentially you plug critical data into this system and it will just keep spitting out different ways of saying the same thing.
Right, I've seen a couple of these. At least the one thing that I'm thinking of, somebody put all of J.K. Rowling's work into it, right? All the Harry Potter books and everything, and they tried to have a self-generated sort of Harry Potter 9 book, right? Or whatever it is, Harry Potter 8 book.
Well, I think this is on a much smaller scale, and it's been done by universities, I think mostly at the moment, or it's their kind of, their entrepreneur departments. There's one called Quill. And I'm actually just waiting for demos from a couple of these companies. But it's on a much smaller scale. So it's like the natural language output for data visualization. So if you put in critical facts about certain things, it will generate the stories around them. So short texts based on critical pieces of data about relationships and things like that. Now, it sounds like, computers gone mad, but we've come across literally hundreds of organizations that are all doing the same thing in terms of their data and information gathering. and then just kind of thinking, okay, how do I rewrite this Facebook post, or how do I rewrite this short blog post for our website, and things like that. So I just think that if we could remove a lot of that duplication that we're all doing the same thing poorly. Essentially, we're using new technology to do the old things faster. That's all we're doing. We're not doing anything new. I wonder if that might free up some of our kind of brain space and resources for us to think in more interconnected ways. I think that we're so addicted to just kind of being the first one to say, hey, there's this relationship between this fact and this fact, there's this causal relationship between that and that, and we're just so kind of hooked on that. I'd like to just kind of delegate that to a computer, so that with the humans who can actually make the connections between the things that are important, saying, do you know what, because of the epidemic of obesity and what that does in terms of diabetes, that age-old relationship between diabetes and tuberculosis is actually going to be much more important than we thought. And if we didn't think about that, we're going to have escalating tuberculosis levels that are probably going to undermine everything we're trying to do globally about TB just because of diabetes. We think it with smoking, but people are just beginning to go, oh yeah, hundreds of year old piece of knowledge about diabetes and tuberculosis being related is actually becoming more important because of obesity. Where are the people joining those dots? They're not. I think this kind of natural language generation could be really useful for freeing up some of our communication managers' time to do that.
Tim, I feel like we could probably sit here and talk for another 2 hours.
We probably will.
I'm grateful. I'm grateful for all of our guests, but I've got to let you go at this stage. But thank you so much for being a guest on the show.
Thank you very much, Stephen, and keep up the podcast. We love it.
Hey guys, thanks for listening. If you found value in my conversation with Tim, please take a moment to open up iTunes or Google Play or Stitcher or SoundCloud or whatever your podcast app happens to be and click on subscribe. And also consider giving the show a rating because it really does help us. And finally, please consider sharing this episode or the podcast on Facebook or Twitter to help others get in on making aid and development better. Thanks. You've been listening to the Terms of Reference podcast from Aidpreneur.com. Subscribe to us on iTunes.